Allow me to give the floor to Alexandru Racu, who will present a Romanian perspective. Alexandru, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sotiris, and I just wanted to emphasize a little bit the fact that, unlike you, I have a lot of theoretical ideas as well, but partly because I am a political scientist by formation, and partly because I quite did not have the time to develop those theoretical ideas sufficiently, and also because of the fact that I think it's very important, at least for us, to kind of know what's happening in our churches, first of all, to have that idea. I'm gonna concentrate more on the historical part, on what happened, and interpretations of what happened as I go. So first of all, I'm going to start by saying a general thing that people haven't mentioned already, is that Eastern Europe is the region of the world that has been hardest hit by COVID. 9 out of the 10 countries with the highest number of deaths caused by COVID per million of inhabitants are located in Eastern Europe, and 4 out of these 9 countries are predominantly Orthodox country. Romania ranks 11th in the world, so we barely missed the top 10 with over 65,000 deaths. So, since the Romanian ecclesial environment was one of the social environments where opposition to vaccination and other public health measures was the strongest in Romania, it was not the only one, you can imagine that the disputes from the Romanian public sphere, of which I'm going to talk, have been very charged, given that at stake were the lives of tens of thousands of our fellow citizens, and of course of our brothers and sisters for us from an Orthodox perspective. These disputes have taken place both within the church, that is, between members of the clergy and the laity with divergent positions, and between members of the church and people of a secular orientation situated outside the church. In what follows, I'm going to present the evolution of the pandemic in Romania, the measures taken by the Romanian government, and the reaction of the church, including here both the clergy hierarchy and laity. Generally speaking, the reaction of the church to the government measures was divided between tacit and reluctant acceptance on the one hand, and opposition on the other hand, with few cases of enthusiastic support. As the pandemic evolved, positions evolved as well, with some distancing themselves from certain measures that they initially supported. And since the government imposed or recommended different measures, social distancing, mask wearing, and vaccination, the reaction to the public health measures adopted by the government was not homogeneous. As sometimes people have agreed with some of the measures, but not with others. But in general, these were the exceptions. People who agreed with some at the beginning agreed with all, and people who disagreed with some at the beginning disagreed with all. This is the rule. These are the exceptions. Okay. Romania registered its first case of coronavirus on February 26, 2020, while all eyes were on Italy, where the pandemic was gaining speed. The Romanian public opinion and the Romanian authorities were particularly worried, given the fact that more than 1 million Romanians lived in Italy, many of whom were migrant seasonal workers, which meant that Romania was much more exposed than other countries through its Italian diaspora. So we were particularly scared. Interesting enough, even before large-scale restrictions had been imposed by the Romanian government, a religious conflict had already started inside the church. It was a conflict between those who thought that church life should bow down before the rules of nature, or at least seek some form of compromise with them and with the prescriptions of the scientific community, on the one hand, and those who thought that church life, as the life of the resurrected Christ, is immune to disease and other death sources affecting corrupted nature, and should therefore go ahead unabated in accordance with what has been prescribed once and for all by church tradition. The trigger of this conflict, even before Romanian authorities started to take significant measures, was a press release issued surprisingly by the Romanian Patriarchate on February 27, one day after our first case, in which His Beatitude Patriarch Daniel announced, I quote, several temporary exceptional measures to which the church was adapting to the new pandemic context. The measures included the dispensation for those fearful of catching the virus in the church, who were permitted to refrain from kissing church icons and to commune with a single-use spoon brought from home, not with the common spoon used by all the believers. The press release was instantly denounced by lay conservatives and members of the lower clergy. I'm going to call them conservatives. I don't know if it is the most appropriate term to use, but I'm referring here to those Christians who were like essentially not willing to modify their practices, and they thought that this modification is basically it's basically betraying the faith. It won't go. It's like you can't serve God and Mammon at the same time. You can't serve God and COVID and the scientific community at the same time. So that was the view. Okay. So there was a popular reaction in the church, and when this reaction occurred the next day, probably Patriarch Daniel did not anticipate that there will be such a reaction. I don't know, which was basically on social media, confronted with the outrage that it had stirred with its initial press release on February 27. The Romanian Patriarchate issued another communique the next day on February 28, in which it sought to calm down the spirits by making the following statements. I quote: "The communique of the press office of the Romanian Patriarchate from February 27, 2020 was issued in the context of an excessive mediatization of the pandemic provoked by the coronavirus and of some requests from state institutions that the church take measures to prevent the spreading of the virus." So what the Patriarchate was hinting here was that the Romanian state was exercising pressure over the church to adapt its liturgical practice to the new epidemiological context. And somehow it was, the Patriarch was washing his hands. It was suggesting that we didn't really believe what we wrote. They made us do it, the government. The communique continued by saying that the initial communique was addressed to those whose faith was weaker, so only to those, but that in no way was it aiming at changing the existing rule of administering communion with a single spoon. It was just a dispensation for those whose faith was weak. The communique ended by strongly reaffirming, I quote, "the fact that the Holy Eucharist is not and can never be a source of sickness and death, but a font of new life in Christ, or forgiveness of sins and of healing of soul and body." Okay, basically we can already see here that the Patriarch of the Romanian Orthodox Church, Daniel, is somehow caught between the state authorities on the one hand, supported by a part of society, and let's call them conservative Christians within the church, who are threatening to make a lot of noise, and who knows, maybe even a schism. So he's trying to basically, the story of the way he navigated together with most of the church hierarchy the pandemic, is trying to keep this middle course between these two sides, which were trying to pull him in a direction or another. Needless to say, while the first communique was welcomed by secular liberals, in Romanian society, while infuriating conservative Christians, the second communique, when mostly like Patriarch Daniel retracted, or not retracted, but clarified what he said initially, so as not to give the impression that he was somehow negotiating Holy Communion, infuriated secular liberals and triggered a series of vicious attacks against the church Christians who commune with the same spoon and kiss icons and relics, being lambasted and demonized for undermining the government and social efforts of stopping the pandemic. So you guys know the history. Everybody kind of told me the same thing, and I guess it's more or less the same thing in each of our churches. The church hierarchy, which at this point spoke only through the voice of the press office of the Romanian Patriarchate, with no dissent among the hierarchy, was trying to maintain a very difficult equilibrium, as I said, between that part of its flock, which was staunchly opposed, and the Romanian authorities, with which the Orthodox Church, as all Orthodox churches, has a very close connection with the state. and of course to protect the church from attacks that were becoming ever more vehement and aggressive given the emotionally charged environment and the life and death stake. After the Romanian government gradually implemented a series of ever more tougher restrictions in the first half of March 2020, on March 16, President Klaus Iohannis of Romania declared a state of emergency, and on March 24, Romania entered into an almost full lockdown that lasted until May 15. During this period, schools moved online, restaurants, bars, theaters, parks, cemeteries, and non-essential shops have been closed. People were allowed to leave the house only to buy food, medicine, to exercise, or to help family members. By government decree, participation in funeral, baptism, and wedding services was limited to a maximum of 8 persons, and no public participation was allowed for regular church service. You could not enter a church as a layman. You couldn't go there to pray individually. However, church services could still be held by priests inside the churches without the faithful and with the participation of a maximum of 3 choir singers. On March 22nd, 2 days before the beginning of the lockdown, the Patriarchy issued new guidelines for spiritual services during the state of emergency, which indicated that the faithful, especially those ill, could confess and receive communion at home on request, on condition that all sanitary measures recommended by the government were to be respected, including the disinfection of all liturgical objects that were being used. March 27 was the eve of the Feast of the Annunciation, was on a Tuesday. But the lockdown that was supposed to begin on the 24th, March 24, the lockdown that was supposed to begin on the 24th was not announced overnight, but a week before. And while the church hierarchy did accept without protests, though neither with enthusiasm, the new measures, advising the faithful, I quote, to strictly respect all the public health measures, some in the Romanian society, in general those who don't frequent the church very often and never miss an opportunity to attack her, expecting more of the church, and were enraged when liturgy was held as usual on Sunday, March 22nd, when it was still legal to do it because the lockdown had been announced, but it was starting on the 24th, being, of course, horrified by the images of Orthodox Christians receiving communion with the same spoon. And reactions were from an MP from the Liberal Save Romania Union filed a complaint to the district attorney in Cluj requesting a criminal investigation for the undermining of the public health measures meant to stop the pandemic. One well-known liberal intellectual said that the church hierarchy had to be jailed, I quote, for its direct contribution to the spread of the pandemic, and that this was a good opportunity to nationalize the properties of the church. While the former advisor of Save Romania Union's leader and a well-known liberal influence has called the Romanian Orthodox Church, I quote, a demonic sect, an insult for which he was later fined by the Anti-Discrimination National Council. But while for secular liberals it was not enough, for conservatives within the church who accused the church hierarchy of betrayal, it was certainly too much. Again, the patriarch is in the middle. This is the story of the Romanian pandemic. And of course, there were many others in the church who, although not vocally opposed as the last group, were certainly reluctant, hesitant, worried, and prone to losing their patience quite rapidly. The situation was even more dramatic in the circumstances in which the lockdown was imposed, as you all know, during Lent, and Pascha was approaching. Finally, it is worth noting that while the church was confronted concomitantly with external threats and internal divisions, it was providing financial support and relief to those affected by the pandemic, increasing throughout 2020 its charitable contributions from 32.3 million euros in 2009 to 38 million euros in 2020. Although initially the church hierarchy actually didn't speak, only spoke to the voice of Patriarch Daniel, who was the only one who was speaking, the others were silent, and the opposition to his compromise with the Romanian state initially was voiced only by people from the lower clergy or members of the laity. Soon this opposition will also gain a voice in the Synod of the Romanian Orthodox Church. The first bishop who openly criticized the restrictions imposed on church life and who called on Romanian authorities to open the churches just 9 days after the lockdown had been imposed, has been Archbishop Theodosie of Tomis, who throughout the pandemic will become a sort of bête noire of the liberal media and a leader of the Christian opponents of the public health measures. His calls for opening the churches on Pascha were not heeded by the Romanian authorities. However, the Interior Minister, Marcel Vela, who in accordance with the Romanian law was responsible with the implementation of the emergency measures, reached another compromise with the Patriarch Daniel, with the purpose of providing some sort of solace to the faithful that were not allowed to celebrate the resurrection of the Lord in church as usual. The Interior Ministry and the Romanian Patriarchate agreed that priests and volunteers from parishes were going to distribute to the faithful at their residences the holy light brought by plane from Jerusalem, as well as the blessed bread that is usually distributed on Pascha at the end of the church service. When news of the agreement between the church and the Interior Ministry reached the Romanian media, a new wave of vitriol was unleashed against the Romanian Orthodox Church and its supposedly responsible unscientific behavior, and news of the agreement led to a public intervention of the Romanian president, Klaus Iohannis, apparently unaware of what his interior minister approved. And on an alarm tone, he warned people to stay home for Pascha, I quote, for otherwise after holidays we will have funerals. Despite the president's warning, the distribution of the holy light and bread went ahead with just minor changes to the initial plan, but by Pascha, which was celebrated on April 19, Theodosia was no longer alone in the synod. In their Paschal letters, various bishops voiced at least their concern, if not their outright denunciation of the new normal that was being imposed on society and on the church, one of them asking rhetorically in his Paschal letter, I quote, "What place is there for us believers and for our gatherings in the house of the Lord in a world dominated by and through fear, in a world of interdictions, in a world that eliminated God from its center and for which the liturgy is just an ordinary public gathering with a high risk of infection?" With direct reference to the public intervention of President Iohannis, the embittered bishop noted that a small Paschal consolation that was conceded with great difficulty by the public authorities had been turned into a new occasion for intimidating the faithful. I quote, "that an event that would have brought serenity, peace, and confidence for all, not just for the faithful, has been presented as an event that will generate funerals." In fact, it can be argued that this renewed attack against the church, when this agreement was signed with the Interior Ministry, this time spearheaded by the Romanian president himself, has represented a turning point that triggered a clear shift of general mood within the church, with many who have more or less meekly accepted the initial compromise, clearly losing their patience, and those hesitant and or silent joining the ranks of those who opposed this from the very beginning. The direct explanation comes from the fact that at a time when all Orthodox Christians were deeply affected by the impossibility to celebrate in the full liturgical sense the greatest feast of Christianity, these same Orthodox Christians came to realize that many of those whose fears and concerns they have sought to accommodate in the name of bodily health didn't care at all about their feelings or their concerns for what may be termed as spiritual health. You know, we have a saying in Romanian, "I gave you a finger and you took away my whole hand." And that was kind of the thing. I mean, it's like, okay, we stayed home for Pascha, but, you know, like finally the patriarch managed to, like, you know, bring us the candle at the door, you know, and, you know, distribute it with all the necessary measures. And you started like attacking us again as being like criminals and as if we did no effort. So then why would we bother to try to be good citizens in the new acceptance of the word? But on the other hand, the shift in attitude cannot be explained simply by this new perception of a zero-sum conflict between what were actually two irreconcilable religions, one aiming for health and the preservation of biological life at all costs, while the other was aiming for salvation and the affirmation of integral true life, even at the risk of spreading deadly pathogens. a perception that was masked by the initial illusion of cooperation between science and the sufficiently flexible religion. So at the beginning, let's say that the public support for the cooperation model was greater because people were more afraid of COVID and they didn't know how the others would react. But as people became less afraid of COVID and saw that the others were saying, okay, we got you to stay locked in the house, but we're going to take you to court as well because we found that you had communion before the lockdown, and we're going, we're calling for nationalization of church property, and we're like being aggressive. And okay, people said, okay, there is no peace, there's no cooperation with these people. It's actually a war, and we have to kind of prepare for it. It's important to note that by now, by Pascha, many had started to feel the economical and psychological brunt of the lockdown, and many were outraged by the numerous heavy fines that the Romanian authorities were imposing on a scared, generally poor and now even more impoverished population, and by reports of police abuses. The initial consensus in supporting the public health measures was greatly damaged as well when images of thousands of crowded migrant agricultural workers who were waiting at Cluj International Airport to board on planes for Germany, where with the secret blessing of the Romanian government, were supposed to pick asparagus for Germans who were unwilling to do this job themselves. These images reached the Romanian media, and through the media, the millions of Romanians who were locked in their houses, unable to go to church, work, or visit their friends and families, while the Romanian government was shipping foreign workers in unhealthy conditions at the request of the German government. And that has said, okay, I know we're staying locked down, we don't go to church and you do that stuff. So we're not going to be duped anymore by this thing. And of course, it's important to understand the reaction of churches. It's important to understand the whole social picture. Meanwhile, thousands of patients suffering from chronic conditions, in many cases cancer, were deprived of much needed and potentially life-saving medical assistance because the Romanian authorities had converted many hospitals into COVID wards, anticipating a huge influx of COVID patients. But the emergency care units were very far from reaching full capacity at this point, and the occupancy rate was approximately eight times lower than it would be in the fall of 2021, when we will have a real problem with COVID. Whether that low occupancy in the spring was a result of the lockdown, which in the eyes of the public opinion had become a victim of its own success, so it worked so well and nobody was believing it anymore, or whether the Romanian authorities have gravely miscalculated the danger of COVID and effectively killed an yet unknown and unacknowledged number of Romanians as a result thereof, it is not for me to establish, and it is outside of the purpose of this paper. But this is certainly what many came to believe, while others were increasingly convinced that they had been duped, becoming the victims of a sinister plan whose goals had nothing to do with health, whether public or private, biological or spiritual. So, the visible shift of attitude within the church must be seen as a part of a more broader popular backlash against the government that implemented the initial draconic public health measures and the liberal pro-Western segment of Romanian society, which with few exceptions has supported those measures. But it is also important to emphasize that despite some individual cases of discontinuity, the new conflict over the public health measures has overlapped on already existing fault lines, aggravating a much more older cultural war that had gone by that point through various phases. So what Andrei said, this was like basically you had a social conflict, but you had the social conflict with people who have fought before for various other reasons and who have come to identify each other as enemies more and more as time passed by. Now, briefly speaking, I think that there have been 3 stages in the evolution of this, let's call it cultural war in post-communist Romanian history. Throughout the 90s, after the collapse of communism, basically there was a revival of the Orthodox faith. There were young people who were coming to church. There were churches who were being built. There was the church occupying back the public sphere and without facing any contestation. Even people who were not as, biased or going to church very much, were respecting the church. And the only kind of criticism which was targeted against the church during this period, during the 90s, was essentially for not dealing with the fact that some of its hierarchs have cooperated with the communist regime and not basically confessing that and exposing them, and for basically not restituting the properties confiscated by the communist government from the Union Greek Catholic Church, which were given to the Romanian Orthodox Church. But these were like criticism which did not attack like the essence of Orthodoxy or its practices. They were basically trying to purify Orthodoxy from its like impure association with the communist regime, and they were often voiced by people who were whose let's say whose Orthodox faith was unquestionable. So it was not something that was like against Orthodoxy. It was basically many people from the Orthodox Church said this as well. But from the mid-2000s, the tide of the public perception has begun to turn, especially among the young people. And I say that the first stage in this evolving conflict was when the Orthodox Church initiated a project to build the so-called People's Salvation Cathedral, or the National Cathedral, which was an older 19th century project that was always postponed, and then postponed during communism. And now, especially after Patriarch Daniel was elected as Patriarch in 2007, and very good entrepreneur known as such, he pushed for this project very strongly, and the project started to move. But many in Romanian society saw this as being too symbolically aggressive, a cathedral that was way too big and was basically something to kind of like show the power of Orthodoxy and intimidate dissenters. And they thought it was obscenely expensive, being the highest, will be the highest, it is already, because now we're finishing it, the highest Orthodox cathedral in the world. They said it was too like obscenely expensive to for a country that was so poor and that had so many social problems and that was spending so little on health and education. And that gave birth to a so-called slogan, we want hospitals, not cathedrals. That kind of became the the rallying slogan of the secular, liberal, pro-Western part of society. This conflict has reached a boiling point in the fall of 2015 in the context of a tragedy that happened in Romania. On the 9th of October 30, 2015, there was a fire at the club in Bucharest that hosted a rock concert, which left 60 people died, 60 people dead, and many more mutilated for life, almost all of the victims being young people. So within this context, a wave of protests emerged against the government, government being considered to be responsible for the fire due to its corruption. But the protests soon turned against the Orthodox Church as well. Not clear why at the beginning. Some perceived that the Orthodox Church had supported the current bid for presidency of the prime minister 1 year before, which failed. He lost the elections. Others saw basically they were against corruption, but they saw the church as essentially corrupt, as basically taking money from people for church, for spiritual services, and this was the way that it was portrayed in the media. And while others, what happened was that in this context, on the night when when the fire broke, and and everybody was horrified in Bucharest, because many people knew. I mean, I had my nephew was there, and he just left 15 minutes earlier, and thank God he was spared. And I had a friend who was there, and basically managed to exit among the last who were able to exit after the fire killed the rest. And in this context, there were this kind of conservative Christians that were, many of them opposed to the public health measures, kind of started writing stuff that those young people died were basically punished by God for listening to satanic metal and stuff like that. And that caused a wave of outrage in a very tense situation against the church, and young people started booing churches. And the last straw was the fact that the mourners who gathered in front of that club to mourn the victims have started to call on Patriarch Daniel to come there in front of the club and pray with the people there for the victims. But Patriarch Daniel did not come, most likely because of two reasons. One, by the moment he was called, the situation was already too tense, and he was not able to manage it. And second, although he is a very cool-minded and balanced person and a very good entrepreneur, he has no charisma, and he doesn't have, much of pastoral grace, and he was simply unable to handle such a difficult situation. And that, of course, left the impression for many young people that the church was not only, let's say, not only corrupt and narrow-minded, but was also callous. While those in the church remained with the church hierarchy as well, remained with the expression that the church was being scapegoated by an increasingly aggressive and ignorant secularist movement. And I would say that the third moment in this conflict, which has kind of created the battle lines that then met again during the pandemic, was the 2018 referendum for the constitutional redefinition of marriage. This was an initiative by the so-called Pro-Family Coalition, which was a coalition of Christian NGOs, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant, that gathered signatures to initiate the change of the constitution so that the constitution would indicate specifically that marriage is only between a man and a woman. Before that, it was said that marriage is between husbands. And in order to, it was kind of like a preemptive strike against LGBT activists in order to prevent possible modification of the constitution that would legalize gay marriage. They had this preemptive constitutional referendum, which again, basically led to a very charged atmosphere and to conflicts and to accusations and people yelling at each other for various reasons. And the referendum finally failed because of a lack of quorum. Too little persons turned out to vote, but it failed and left the many conservatives in the church with a feeling of embitterment and of resentment. As I said, okay, let me just clear. Okay. So basically, this is why it was hard for these people, basically these people with whom this church conservatives in general fought these wars were now basically telling them to stay home, and they were calling for tough police action against those who didn't. And that was one of the reasons why I think not the only reason why basically any sort of common interest, public interest based on a common good and on public health measures it was very hard to articulate because people were already in a relation of enmity. Okay, on May 15, the state of emergency officially ended and was replaced with a so-called state of alert that lasted without interruption until the spring of 2022, until about 1 month ago. During the state of alert, new restrictions have been imposed. They have been toughened or loosened depending on the evolving situation. But Romania never again entered a full-scale lockdown. And if we ignore the fact that schools were moved online for almost the entire 2020-2021 school year, and hundreds of thousands of poor children from poorer rural areas who didn't have access to internet simply had no school, during this period, there have been much fewer restrictions in Romania when compared to Western Europe during the fall of 2020 and winter of 2021, when all Europe, including us, was hit by a second and third wave. But there have been restrictions, partial or total, on clubs, restaurants, gyms, etc., as well as on protests, and few economic support measures to compensate those who were hurt by the public health measures. Combined with the widespread perception that the government was poorly managing the pandemic, the measures led to a collapse of the ruling National Liberal Party in the opinion polls. It is important to mention that throughout this period, the church enjoyed a privileged status, like in Bulgaria, but not from the very beginning, as, except for the obligation to wear a mask, which was rarely enforced, church services have not been subjected to any restrictions anymore, even though gatherings of similar size for other purposes were banned during this period sometimes. Some argued that the government authorities were afraid to further antagonize the church while they were confronted with growing discontent, but others may argue that they sincerely felt that depriving Romanians of the comfort of the church services was simply too much to ask during this time where many were mourning or were struggling with loneliness, depression, and anxiety. The only significant exception from this privileged regime regarded the organization of large-scale pilgrimages, and Romania's most important pilgrimage, the Iasi pilgrimage on the feast of Saint Paraskevi, and the Bucharest pilgrimage of the feast of Saint Demetrius the New, are taking place in October, on October 14 and October 27. But by this time, Romania was well into its second wave, with new infections and deaths rapidly growing. And by the time the wave peaked at the end of November, unlike in the spring, the health system was indeed overwhelmed, and it became harder for public opinion to deny that COVID was indeed a dangerous virus. It was no longer something that most people were seeing only on TV, but something that most people were also seeing, unfortunately, around them as well, in their families or among their friends. In this context, beginning from midsummer, the Romanian authorities gradually began to tighten restrictions, and by the beginning of October, bars and indoor restaurants were again closed. However, church services were permitted, and the yearly pilgrimage on the feast of Saint Paraskevi on October 14, which in previous years had often gathered approximately 1 million inhabitants, 1 million pilgrims, has not been banned. But the government restricted the access to the holy relics only to residents of Jassy. Again, why for more liberal-minded Romanians this was not enough, they were saying, no, like shut it down all, for many pious Orthodox Christians, this was too much, and it led to a tense situation in front of the Jassy Metropolitan Cathedral on the feast day, where worshippers from outside Jassy, most of them without masks, started booing and in some cases even pushing the gendarmes, chanting slogans such as freedom, shame on you, and respect the Constitution. One of the figures that stood out from the crowd during that day, as well as during the various small-scale anti-mask and nighttime restriction protests that had been organized beginning with the summer of 2020, was a lawyer from Bucharest named Diana Ivanovic, who became a sort of tribune of the people against the sanitary dictatorship. In fact, while the number of deaths was rising and restrictions were tightened, popular discontent was growing in an ever more gloomy atmosphere. The church as well voiced its discontent, becoming to a large extent a part of this popular front that included other forms of discontent, economical, or young people who were not allowed to party, or parents who were exasperated by online schoolings and stuff like that. The Metropolitan of Moldavia, Teofan, who has episcopal sees in Jassy, protested against the government measure that prevented worshippers who did not reside in Jassy from worshipping the relics of Saint Paraskevi, and called the measure a discriminatory measure which violates numerous legal provisions and international principles that protect the freedom of religious expression. By October 27, the feast day of Saint Demetrius the New, the epidemiological situation had significantly worsened, and although at a certain point the Prime Minister declared that he intended to ban the Bucharest pilgrimage altogether, a few days later he changed his mind and allowed to go on like in Jassy with only residents from Bucharest. On the eve of the feast, in a significant change of tone, Patriarch Daniel, who up until now had been mostly cautious and cooperative, has recalled the government authorities, so after what happened in Jassy, that in the fall of 1989, the communist authorities had banned the pilgrimage to Saint Demetrius the New, pretexting that an important meeting of the Great National Assembly was taking place in a nearby building. And then he said the patriarch, after a couple of days, the communist regime collapsed. Yes, I see that I'm like, how much time do I still have? Or did I like went overboard already?
Overboard.
Like, let me just check.
A conclusion would be very welcome.
Sorry? A conclusion would be very, very good at this point. Okay, just give me a second to see. Okay, yes, I am like, yeah, but we started a little bit later anyway.
This has been factored in.
Sorry?
This has been factored in.
This has been factored in. Okay, so basically at this point, there was this reaction of Patriarch Daniel. And the thing is, like, one important aspect is to notice that on December 6th, we had elections. And given all this popular discontent, which is included like positions coming from the church and from Christians who were upset about this problem, we had on December 6th, basically the current government almost lost their majority, but we had like a new far-right party who entered parliament, surging from 1% in local elections in September to 9% at the beginning of December, which was like basically a surge. And a party which was, among others, supported by some Orthodox intellectuals, and which had also some of them who were trying to rehabilitate in their previous writings the Romanian interwar far right, which is another different story, which came into the picture. That was one thing. So we had this party gaining prominence, and basically then the Romanian politicians were afraid to take any more public health measures of fear of that this party would further grow and would become a real political problem. Then it is important to notice that after that, when the vaccination campaign started at the beginning in the spring, we had like a very, it went very well for a couple of months, but by midsummer it has stalled. And Romania, as well as had the lowest vaccination rate at the beginning of September 2021 in Europe, with the exception of Bulgaria. And in the fall of 2021, we had a devastating fourth Delta wave, which for 2 weeks brought us to the point where we were having the highest number of deaths per day in the world. And of course, the conflict became even more stronger at this point, with basically many in the church opposing vaccination. The idea is that the Patriarch of the Romanian Orthodox Church resisted calls for public endorsing the vaccination campaign or calls from Orthodox anti-vaxxers to criticize the government for the so-called discriminatory measures. And in the end, we've been through that. There were some restrictions, but they were like far from what others expected. And by the spring, the measures were eliminated. So I'm gonna stop here. I'm just like briefly wrapped it up at the end to because
many thanks, dear Alexandru. Many thanks. Is there any question to Alexandru before we go to Zmilan? If not, I have a very brief one, but please, I ask for a very brief response.
Yeah, I'm sure I will do that.
Could you say one comment on how science was represented, but really, just a sentence on how science was represented during all this? Was it a new deity, a new religion? Was it simply science without any scientism?
I mean, it depends on like who, because for some there was this like, yes, what you said, this sort of new deity, science, governing us, science showing us the light, like basically science replacing religion and stuff like that. For others, there was this sort of, as you said, like anti-vax conspiracy theories saying, well, I could know the true science, look at it. I found this link, on the internet where there is this, doctor who has a PhD from, I don't know, who's saying the truth about the vaccines. And, there was like this who were represented. And those who were like saying, more subtle, who are like, basically quoting Agamben and stuff like that, who were saying that basically, there is like a conflict between science, religion, and capitalism, and now science is kind of imposing a monopoly, and it is being used as a political tool in order to impose this sort of apocalyptic form of social control. So all three were present, but depending on who spoke.
Thank you very much.